Movie licensed video games are often the butt of jokes when it comes to any serious conversation around video games. After all, for years and even to this day, there are many examples of where a game based on a movie has been nothing more than a quick cash-in, aimed at squeezing a bit more profit from the source film. Long before the Nintendo 64 existed, we'd been getting movie licensed video games, and so no surprises to anyone that the Nintendo 64 had its own fair share of games based on movies. So for today's video, we're taking a quick look at each of the titles that are based on movies. And of course you can comment below which ones you think were good and which ones you want to warn your fellow gamers to avoid. And as always, if you want a full review of any of these games, then check out the description box where I'll post links to the individual reviews. Goldeneye is always the first game that comes to mind for me when I think about movie licensed video games. With the movie hitting theatres in 1995, it was common at the time for any time video games to be released around the same time. You've all heard the stories by now, so I won't go into further detail here, but the Nintendo 64 game was released nearly 2 years after the movie was in theatres, and that was time well spent by the developers making this game an absolute masterpiece. For its time, this was a phenomenal title and a monumental one. Giving players a deep first-person shooter experience on a home console with this much action was unheard of at the time, and the multiplayer mode alone became a thing of legend, and perhaps single-handedly shifted millions of N64 console sales with friends eager to host their own tournaments. What I personally loved, however, was that the game managed to find the perfect balance between sticking to the movie storyline whilst adding its own missions and objectives which complement the larger narrative the game needed to tell. The graphics were decent, the music was sublime, and the game's controls seemed a perfect match for the Nintendo 64's unusual controller. From a movie perspective, the film was a reboot of the James Bond franchise, which had been on a hiatus for a few years after not performing as well as it really should have been. The same too could be said for the FPS genre. With many games still trying to come out and be the next Doom or Quake clone, few would have expected Rare to be the ones which delivered the FPS experience which would for a long time become the benchmark to which console FPS games were held up to. Toy Story 2 is perhaps the game which everyone remembers the most because, quite honestly, it's based off one of the best movies ever made. On the back of that, like many young people, I also couldn't wait to revisit the world in which the movie takes place with the release of Toy Story 2 on N64. Developed by Traveller's Tales and published by Activision in 1999, Toy Story 2 follows the plot of the movie as closely as possible, and that's not a bad thing. You'll play as Buzz Lightyear and work your way through the various levels using your power-ups to complete the objectives and earn tokens. Buzz upgrades as the game progresses, and like Banjo-Kazooie, each level often has multiple tasks for you to complete to earn more tokens. Whilst the game is definitely fun to play, the most interesting thing about the game's development was that Activision's offices were actually protested against by the Hispanic community. They didn't like the villain who had a mustache, a bullet bandolier and a sombrero, and so after a peaceful protest they changed the villain to avoid offending the Hispanic community. On its release, the game was met with favourable reviews, and rightly so. The graphics are good enough, the handling is fine, and there's plenty of variation in the level objectives, and the level designs do keep you coming back because they are unique and interesting. So even the most die-hard Toy Story fan will continue playing this game right the way to the end. Sure, at times the camera can be tricky, but if you can overlook some minor flaws in the game, it's one which is likely to bring you as much happiness as the movies themselves. My advice though is to play the Dreamcast version, which is the best of the home console editions. It also has additional content not found in the N64 cart release. The World Is Not Enough was a fun entry into the James Bond movie franchise, and was another Pierce Brosnan romp to further cement the new vision for the James Bond franchise. After Rare turned down the opportunity to make further Bond games, instead preferring to develop their own IPs, the 007 license was up for grabs. Electronic Arts, having a bag full of cash, threw money to acquire the rights to make games based on the movie as part of a multi-movie deal. The end result was that the Nintendo 64 was getting another Bond FPS shooter, but this time Rareware weren't at the helm. So is TWINE better than Goldeneye? No. Is TWINE better than Goldeneye? Yes. It really depends who you're asking here, as pretty much universally people will tell you Goldeneye was better, but that's largely down to the absolutely monumental amount of nostalgia attached to the title. In reality, TWINE is technically a better game, and had Goldeneye never existed, then this would be more fondly remembered. But you could argue that without Goldeneye, TWINE would never have existed, so it's a catch-22 situation. But putting petty arguments to one side, because they are both really fun games and have their own unique differences, which means that they can coexist together as two stunning examples of how to make a bloody good movie licensed game. With tons of weapons and gadgets, a great storyline and level locations to play through, and a multiplayer mode that's just as fun as its mentor, The World Is Not Enough deserves to be in everyone's collection. With Disney releasing Tarzan into movie theatres as their 37th feature-length animated movie, it was no surprise by that time that the video games would follow. Now, I remember being particularly interested in this title after hearing it would be a 2.5D platform game and seeing screenshots of it in magazines. Following the plot of the movie, you'll start the game playing as young Tarzan, and you'll need to learn the skills to progress through the game from your trusty sidekick Turk. As the story progresses, you'll then play as adult Tarzan, and it handles slightly differently depending on which age of Tarzan you're playing as. I don't think there's anything not to like about this game. The graphics have their own unique charm to them, the gameplay is fairly solid enough, on a little easy side if you are being critical, especially for those who are experienced platform game fans. The character and enemy designs are nicely done, and the limited voice acting in the game is also a welcome addition when we were so often starved of voiceovers on the Nintendo 64. Like most platform games of the time, there's plenty of collectibles to pick up, and in doing so you'll learn new lives, scenes from the movie, and bonus levels which are surprisingly fun to play. The only real negative I can say about the game is its handling. As Tarzan moves on his hands and his feet as both child and adult, there's a strange momentum feel to the character, and this can make some jumping sections trickier than they really should be. Still, for anyone like me who loves 2D and 2.5D games, this one is a must play. It's a fairly easy game with only 14 levels, but you'll complete it well before you become bored of it. I personally feel that the game is better than the movie, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I was a big fan of Nickelodeon in the mid to late 90s, and like many people of my generation, I remember watching a whole ton of the famous cartoons and shows, which I'd definitely say were a key part of my childhood. The problem for me, however, was that by the time Rugrats in Paris hit movie theatres, it was the year 2000, and I'd grown out of watching this type of show, and so I had no interest in seeing the movie. No surprises then that I also had no interest in the accompanying video game Rugrats in Paris the movie, which hit Nintendo 64 consoles to little fanfare. To be fair, however, this is a game aimed at the younger generation of N64 owners, and so it's hard for me to honestly form an opinion on a game which really didn't have my requirements at heart. You wander around the theme park collecting what seems like an endless amount of tickets, collecting items to aid you in your quest, and play a range of mini games to win prizes. It's really not the most in-depth game, but for kids who were the target demo, then I'm sure they would have found something to like here. The highlight for me was the voice acting, which sees the actual cast members deliver their lines, and then Factor 5's epic tools were licensed, which gives this game a surprisingly large amount of speech when compared to many other N64 games. If you think of Rugrats in Paris as a kids movie, and the game also as a kids game, then it's a fair enough example of a licensed game, but for anyone over the age of 10 or so, you'll likely find nothing here to get excited about. Perhaps the weakest Disney game on the Nintendo 64 was A Bug's Life. While the movie may have been beaten DreamWorks' movie Ants at the box office when it was released in 1999, the game won't be beating many other platformers. With 15 levels, a plot which mostly follows the movie, and many of the cast lending their vocal talents to the CD-based releases, it was the horrible gameplay and level design which led this to be reviewed poorly. The Nintendo 64 version is even more stripped back, with static cutscenes and text to progress the game's story, and visuals which are quite honestly terrible. Throw in the fiddly controls, a poor camera, and levels which often leave you wondering what to do next, you'll quickly realise that this isn't a game that you want to be a completionist of. My tip is just avoid this title, but if you were unlucky enough to own it as a kid back in the day, then I'd love to know what you thought of it in the comments section. Blues Brothers 2000 was another game created by Player One and published by Titus. This one landed in the year 2000 after significant delays, and no surprises, it was based on the 1998 movie starring comedic legend Dan Aykroyd. Whilst the movie itself wasn't too bad, it offered a musical comedy that didn't live up to the original from 1980, also starring John Belushi. It was, however, a flop at the box office, and the Nintendo 64 game didn't arrive until the year 2000, totally missing any hype from the movie's release. Reading the N64 anthology interview with Eric Kane, he stated that Titus looked to create and publish games from IPs which were undervalued from a video game perspective. That's perhaps why this 3D platform game ever saw the light of day, because it's the kind of game which nobody was asking for. The gameplay is shallow, the controls and camera are a hindrance, and overall it's just not a game you want to go out of your way to play. Reviews of the time were poor, and for the most part I'd agree with them. Star Wars Episode 1 Racer was developed by LucasArts, and it landed on Nintendo 64 in mid-1999. Whilst I'll leave you to comment your own feelings on the movie, there's few that could argue that the best scene was not the epic pod race, but thankfully that's the inspiration for this game. Development of this one also began just after Shadows of the Empire was released, and the studio had very little source material to work with. At one stage, they even had to work out the physics engine for the game from less than 30 seconds of footage showing the actual pod race the game would be based on. However, this lack of knowledge also helped the game in a way. They were not restricted to using Tatooine as a base, and so they were able to create their own race levels to throw in some originality and also creativity into the mix, and this greatly helps the overall feel of the game with some truly cool track design. Thankfully though, they were given all of the characters' details who would be pod racers, and so the game contains the same ones found in the movie, including Sebulba, who is my personal favourite. The N64 version also features 4-player split-screen multiplayer, but given the speed of the game, I would personally recommend no more than 2 players at the same time. As a single-player experience, the game contains a lot of depth. You have all of the courses and tournaments to win, but it was the ability to level up your pod racer which always appealed to me. What was even cooler was that you can buy new, expensive parts with your prize money, but you could also take a punt at the scrapyard and buy a used part. It was always something a compromise between a risk and a reward, as buying used parts meant they were subject to failing and possibly losing the money that you'd spent on it. There were also a number of other areas to upgrade, including your boosters, and so by the end of the game, once you had maxed out your pod racer, you could have something truly special to pilot. A lot of people talk about the fastest racing games on the console, and again that's perhaps best looked at in a separate video of its own. But Episode 1 Racer is a damn fast racing game. Again, with the expansion pack installed, things look even sharper, and the music from the movie is also intertwined with custom made pieces of music for the game. Overall, it felt like a fresh new Star Wars experience for a modern player, and in a way, it lacked a little bit of that nostalgic Star Wars feel that many of us grew up with at the time. But still, when you look at the game without those rosy tints, it's a fine example of how to do a frighteningly quick racing game on the N64. It's fast, intense, and at times hard to handle, and it can be frustrating to the point of rage quitting. And then with a few simple tweaks to your craft, it can become a joy to play again. This is one which I think a lot of people will have already played, but for anyone new to the game, I can't recommend the Nintendo 64 version. Instead, if you want to play on a console, the Dreamcast version is the way to go, but I'd even recommend bypassing consoles altogether and playing the new HD remaster version, which allows full HD resolutions as well as 60 frames per second, and that's hard to argue as now being the best way to play this game. Star Wars Battle for Naboo is perhaps the least remembered Star Wars game on the Nintendo 64, and one which I think is overlooked far too often. It is a follow-up to Rogue Squadron, although it doesn't form part of the Rogue Squadron trilogy, which would only be continued on the GameCube. Developed by Factor 5 and LucasArts, it landed on store shelves in late '99 or early 2000 depending on where on the world you live, and despite at first glance looking like it used the Rogue Squadron engine, it was in fact an entirely new one built exclusively for this game. The game takes place during Star Wars Episode 1, and you take control of Gavin Sykes, who is a lieutenant in the Naboo Royal Security Force. With 15 levels and many of them drawing directly from the movie, being combined with some impressive visuals and great music, you may be surprised by the somewhat mixed reviews the game got. This pretty much came down to one thing only: if the reviewer actually liked the movie. You see, whilst the gameplay was pretty much universally praised, the visuals commended, and the overall package being one of the better games on the console, reviewers were split on the story in the game. It seemed that if they loved the movie, then the game also got a glowing review. If the reviewer felt the movie had been a letdown, then they marked the game down for its storyline and uninteresting missions. In a way, although I would disagree with reviewing a game on that basis, I do think that your enjoyment of the game will come down to how interested you were or are in the movie. As I wasn't a huge fan of Star Wars Episode 1, I found that Rogue Squadron was more my cup of tea. But equally, I know many people that love Star Wars Episode 1 and couldn't wait to get their hands on this game. One thing I did however love about this game was that you're now not only in the air, but you also take on missions on land and on sea. So the craft that you'll pilot and control are more varied than Rogue Squadron, but you'll lose that nostalgic feel as you're unlikely to have the same attachment to a police cruiser in Battle for Naboo as you are with an A-Wing in Star Wars Rogue Squadron. On a technical level, the game is much more playable due to the greatly improved draw distance that the new engine allowed. This wasn't possible on the old engine, and they also implemented the particle system which they had built for Indiana Jones on the N64 into Battle for Naboo, which further enhanced the visuals. This allowed up to 3,000 particles to be displayed without dropping the frame rate, which means that the explosions had a much more satisfying visual aesthetic than Rogue Squadron. Interestingly, the PC port of the game was terribly done. So much so in fact that the PC version received dramatically lower scores than the N64 version, and this is one instance where if you like what you see and have heard, then the Nintendo 64 cart is really the one to pick up and play. Star Wars Battle for Naboo also contains a whole ton of unlockables and secrets. Like Rogue Squadron, it retained the medal award system after each level, which gives a great deal of replayability, and the development team also included around 5 minutes of commentary for each level as a bonus, and so it's one of the earliest instances of this happening in a video game. So there you have it, there's your roundup of the Nintendo 64's games with movie licenses. So which one of those games was your favourite? And which is your favourite all-time video game based on a movie on any platform? Also, was there any games on the PlayStation which were from movie franchises that you'd have loved to have seen be ported to the Nintendo 64? As always, let me know your thoughts, feelings, put any comments you have down below, and until next time.